So you think your photos suck. As a beginner, I think that's one of the first things that I realized was I had no way to know whether I'm actually taking good photos. We can fall into an easy trap of asking other people to judge our photos, and the greatest example of this is posting a photo on social media and then using whether or not people like it as a judgment of if the photo is good. But I think that's a terrible way to start because you can easily fall into the trap of just repeatedly looking for other people's validation for those photos. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to critique your own photos so that you can determine whether or not the photos are good for yourself, as well as be able to see how you can improve your photos. So we'll start off with why I think critiquing your own photos is important and why that skill needs to be learned. Then we'll go over the different parts of critiquing a photo and talk about how I go about critiquing my photos so that I know what I can use to improve on. So let's start off with why it's important to be able to critique your own photos. So the danger with asking other people, even if they are professional photographers who you look up to, is that everyone usually has their own opinions, usually has their own thing that they want to look for in a photo. Sure, there are a couple of things that might make a good photo objectively, but most of the critique that people will give is related to subjective feeling. When someone does ask me to critique their photo, I take a moment to ask them what they wanted or what they wanted to represent from that photo. Because that gives you a better idea of what it is they were going for and what it is they hope to achieve from the photo. Everyone has their own artistic and creative inputs on the photo. I don't want to really mess with what their vision might have been. I just want to make sure that are they able to take their vision and appropriately put it onto the photo. So that's why I think then it becomes a lot more important to be able to critique your own photos, because you can't really put up every single image that you take onto those platforms. You need to be able to tell which photos are good to keep, especially as you start shooting more and more. And then also that will translate into your ability to judge when you're out in the field whether or not a composition or a photo will work. At the end of the day, it's your opinion which matters most for your photos. Whether or not you like your photos will determine how well you will be able to grow in your photography journey. So there are different parts to critiquing a photo. One part is the technical part, which is something that I guess is pretty objective that we can focus on. And the other part is a little bit more subjective, but there's still some objective truths to a photo. And so we'll start off with what it is that you're trying to get out of the photo. For me, at least, it is being able to capture a moment and then relive that moment when I view that photo later on. One of the things I look for in a photo is I want to be able to get lost in that photo. I don't want to be distracted by different elements in the photo that don't play well together. I want everything to work cohesively. So for example, if you have a photo with a lot of rocks, those rocks could be on the edge and that might be a little bit more distracting, or they could be strategically placed within the photo just because you moved around a little bit, determining the right composition, such that they create a nice visual flow and they don't take anything away from any of the other elements, but actually add to the photo. But at the end of the day, what I think makes a photo work well is intentionality. What you want to do when you're taking a photo and when you're looking back at a photo, can you tell if that photo and the things within that photo were placed intentionally in the places that they were supposed to be? Or do you think it was haphazardly done? So when dealing with the technical parts of critiquing a photo, there are a couple of things that I look for, and this is a little bit more objective, so you can actually get a link to the entire checklist that I've created over here of the things that I go through when looking at a photo and determining whether or not it meets some certain technical characteristics. One of the first things that becomes apparent is the photo level? So if you have a horizontal line of the horizon going through the photo, is it level? This is very easily fixable in post-processing, and that is one of the first things that you should do when you actually start editing your photos, is just fixing the level. A slanted photo, unless it's intentionally done, does not look good. The next technical detail that I try to focus on is the subject in focus? And if everything is blurry, that's fine if it wasn't done intentional. So for techniques like intentional camera movement, everything will be blurry, but that is intentionally done for that situation. For most photos that I look at, I don't usually see blurriness as something that should be sought after within the subject itself. Sure, in portraits you might have a blurry background, but for landscape photos, you usually want most of the things to be tack sharp. There might be things in the background you are okay being blurry, that's fine. But if the subject of the photo, the thing that keeps the viewer's attention on the photo, is it sharp? And that can usually be determined by your f-stop. Was the right f-stop chosen? If not, was the photo stacked? And things like that. So easy to look at in your photo. When you zoom in, does it seem blurry? One of the biggest things is exposure. Is the photo properly exposed? Sure, the photo that you take using your camera in RAW mode will not be the end result. So it's fine to have a photo that doesn't look that great on the back of the camera because you know you're going to pull out some of the details in the shadows or in the highlights there. But when you're taking it in your camera, you do have the ability to determine how much detail you allow in the shadows or in the highlights. So there's things called clipping where you can clip the highlights where you can't recover any of the detail in the highlights, or clipping the shadows, meaning when you try to recover any of the details in the shadows, they will just look black. When you try to set your settings for the exposure, you probably clipped off all the shadows and you won't be able to recover from that. If done intentionally, that's fine. A lot of silhouetted photos don't really need to get any details back from the shadows, but when you are taking a photo, if you do want details in your shadows, then setting your exposure properly is one of the biggest things that you need to focus on for your photo. So when I look at a photo, and I can easily tell if something is overexposed or underexposed, especially when you put it into Lightroom, because you can see the histogram, and the histogram tells you whether or not the photo is correctly exposed. When I'm critiquing the edit of a photo, there are some things that are important to know. One thing to know is that editing style can change, and I try not to focus too much on the type of editing style, especially because that is related to the creativity of the photographer. What I try to focus on is whether or not that is actually overdone. So one of the easiest indications of poor editing is if the photo looks like it has been edited. So things like over sharpening, where once you sharpen the photo, you kind of see a halo around all the different edges. That is a clear indication that editing wasn't done properly. And then following that is oversaturation or over clarity or over texturization of the photo, where it just becomes a little bit more crunchy looking than you actually want it to be. You want to have enough detail in certain parts of the photos, and that needs to be done intentionally. You don't want to, for example, blow out the clarity and have everything look like it's jagged and sharp. And then with editing, I think there are different parts that you can also explore. So a similar checklist to the more technical parts, which is, would the photo look better in black and white? So a lot of the times when there's a lot of shadows and a lot of highlights during midday, for example, I convert my photo into black and white because I know those shadows would add much more to the photo than if I was just to keep it in color. I would want to then focus on primarily the shadows and where the light was hitting and disregard the color because I would think it's a little bit too distracting. Another thing is the white balance adjusted? So does this photo seem particularly too orange or particularly too blue? Could that be changed? Does that fit well with the rest of the photos? And so white balance is an easy adjuster that usually I will target at the very beginning of the photo. Another thing is, are the dust spots cleared? So a lot of times if you're shooting in kind of dusty situations or in the fog, you will have spots on your image because water droplets or dust have gotten stuck to your lens. And that is actually pretty easily removed within software like Lightroom. When you're done with your edit, I think it's usually a good idea to walk away from it and take 15-20 minutes doing something else and then coming back to it. There have been a lot of times when I really don't know if my edit is good enough. I will sometimes actually transfer the photo to my phone and then look at it there as well and go away and come back to it so that my eyes have taken some time to adjust to different lights, different conditions, different colors. And when I come back to it, I might realize, oh, I just oversaturated this color too much, or I really need to tone down this certain area. And that has been really helpful in determining whether or not I've over or under edited. So now let's take a look at some of my photos that I've taken, and you've probably seen them on my Instagram as well. And let's see how I critique them, because none of my photos are perfect and I want to try and see what I did wrong and share with you what I think doesn't work and what does work. So this photo I took in Colorado. I was waiting for the sunrise to hit these Flatiron Mountains. But when I had figured out the composition, I realized that the lighting on the cloud was actually pretty nice. And so I decided to take a panoramic photo of this. It doesn't look like a panorama, but believe me, it's a panorama. One of the things that I think you can see from this is the primary subject of this photo are the mountains themselves. And there are a couple of different compositional tools that I've used here. So I've placed the mountains on the right, and I have a couple of different leading lines to it. So the path goes all the way to the mountains. If you follow the curvature of the hill, that leads to the mountains as well. The clouds themselves kind of point downwards into the mountains as well. And so there's a lot of things guiding the viewer onto the mountains themselves. But, and here's what I think is important to know, the path itself starts in the middle. And so all this space on the left of the path could be cut off without actually impacting the photo that much. The only reason that is there is because I wanted the cloud in this photo as well. So I could crop out this photo even more till like right there, but then you don't really see any of the clouds. The path would start in the corner, and I think there's a nice balance between the left and the right grass now, and there's not too much extra space here, but again, then you don't really see the cloud, which might or might not be a problem. Looking at the edges of the photo, there aren't anything that I think distract away too much from the photo itself. Even in the center, there's this tiny tree here, which I think I could have removed, but I decided to leave it there because I think it doesn't, again, distract too much from the main mountains themselves. One thing I don't like is where I've actually cut off the path as well as the railing next to it. So you can see, following the railing, it interferes with the path. Ideally, what I would have liked is the path and the railing would both be visible, or I wouldn't have this cut right below it. And so I think that kind of distracts a little bit from the path itself, and it's not as clean as I would like it to be. The sky, I think, is all right. I think, let's see if I lower it. If I lower it, it still works. I think the sky doesn't really have anything that it really needed. So even just by cutting that part off, the photo still works, and I'm actually now more focused on the mountains and not really distracted by the sky itself. So before I had this, the sky really wasn't adding too much. I do like the clouds as well, but I don't think they add anything specifically to the photo. Here, I know that my subject now is clearly the mountains. Even before it was still clear, but now I can focus primarily on the mountains themselves, and I have a nicer crop around it. Sure, on the sides I have this light, but I don't think it's distracting because it's not too sharp. The highlights are still within the sky, as well as on the mountains. Sure, there's a little bit of highlight here, which is still, I think, a little bit distracting. The one on the right isn't very distracting, but the one on the left might be a little bit distracting. And so going back to my original cut, having that act more of a leading line, works, doesn't work. It doesn't really have anything to balance against. Now that I look at it here, this tree is too close to the edge, and it is a little bit distracting because it is so prominent. It's not like a bunch of different trees that continue. It is a tree standing by itself. So yeah, let's go back to the crop that we had ended up with. Something like this. Lower this. Let's reduce the amount of light there. That's a little bit more cleaner. It's more of a square crop, but you have a nice balance of the clouds on the side, and you don't have too distracting of the highlight elements in here. All right, let's move on to the next photo. So this is a photo I took a while back, and it was a particularly gloomy day, and the sun was just about to come underneath. Unfortunately, it didn't create the effect that I wanted, but it was still pretty brilliant. The harshness of the light was dispersed by the clouds and created this really nice soft glow on top of the mountain that I wanted to capture. So what I was trying to go for is the subject would be the mountain and the light itself together, and so everything else should play a role in assisting that. In my foreground, I have this little balcony here, and the reason I think it doesn't interfere too much is because it's pretty dark around here. So the vision of the viewer will still be guided more towards the light aspect, which is in the center. And so this part isn't really too distracting as a foreground element. I will say that there is this kind of notice on one of the balcony pillars, which I could have cropped out or edited out, but I decided to leave it because I think it would have gotten a little bit too messy, and I think it actually adds a little bit of humanness to the picture. But yeah, moving on. After the viewer is done with the foreground, the midground actually has all these little rocks, islands, small rock islands that kind of lead the viewer back to the mountain itself. And so I think that actually works pretty well, because if this was not here, this whole area would just be dead space, because it wouldn't be actually balancing with anything. It would just be this gap between the foreground and the background. The river on either side I think balances pretty well, because this space on the right balances with the space on the left of the sky pretty well, and this space on the left of the river is a little bit darker, so your attention isn't drawn as much to that side, and it still balances well because on the other side of these rocks is still kind of negative space. Not too worried about the river in the background as well, because it kind of creates the visual flow centered around the mountain. I will say there are some distracting elements on the side that I probably could have gotten rid of. There's this piece of rock here, easy enough to clone out. Probably should have gotten rid of that part. But other than that, I think it looks pretty well. There's this white kind of artifact here as well. Probably could have gotten rid of that. Not too distracting, but it is apparent in the image. And so for the full effect, I probably should have gotten rid of that as well. Alright, so this is another photo that I took in Colorado. I had actually gone on this trail once just to kind of scout out the different compositions, and I immediately was drawn to this tree because of the half dead, half life look that it had. When I came back around, when the light was actually better, I saw this tree and it was amazing. What this photo does well is that behind the tree is almost complete darkness. It's very low light, and so you're able to easily see both the dead and the live part of the tree itself. I think the sharpness is also, again, pretty well done. If you look at here, the trunk itself is pretty sharp, and going down further below, it's not as sharp, but I don't think it really needs to be sharp here, because all this would probably be moving, and it's not something that's necessary to be sharp for the image to work. I actually think because it's a little bit blurry, the light is diffused a little bit instead of being specifically on that. And one of the key features of this image is how the light falls on this side of the mountain or side of the hill, as well as these little specks of grass that just have caught the light in the right way. One thing that I was thinking about was whether or not this light at the bottom is distracting. But I think removing that actually doesn't work as well. The top is framed by this bottom of the mountain slab, and the bottom is framed with these tiny grasses. Maybe I would have liked to see a little bit more of the grasses, because I think that works really well, and I think it's not as strong of a frame as I would like it to be. But I think overall it still creates a pretty nice effect. Over here, maybe I would say I would like to have a little bit more gap over here between the back of the mountain and this tree over here. It's not that big of a deal, but I would like to have seen a little bit more space if possible. But because I couldn't really adjust the height of the camera as much, I knew I wasn't going to be able to get any better. The positioning of the tree I think looks good. I actually really liked it, but again, this bottom part, maybe it could have had a little bit more of the grass visible. Now, this is a photo that I took recently in Ricketts Glen this past fall. I really enjoyed this composition because I saw this beautiful waterfall and the path that went around it, and I'm like, great, the path kind of feels like it could just encompass the waterfall. And so I used my wide angle lens with this and tried to create this visual flow of the path and then coming back into the waterfall itself. But there are a couple things that I think might not work as well. So let's start off with some of the technical parts. It is a little bit shaky here because the leaves were moving a bit. It's not as tack sharp, and I think this could have benefited from being a little bit more sharper with the foreground elements as well. Because the leaves are so tightly connected, it doesn't really matter that much. But I think you can see here, this doesn't really add too much. I would like to have seen it be a little bit more sharp. Again, here, would have liked to see a faster shutter speed to capture that. But then the water might not have the right flow look that I would want it to with a faster shutter speed. Compositionally speaking, I do like this flow around. You want to draw the viewer into the waterfall itself. So you have this path created to the falls, you have this path that goes to the falls. All of these different curves are drawing the viewer's attention back into the waterfalls here. I do feel this waterfall on the edge is a little bit off to the side, and maybe that's a little bit distracting, but I think not too much, because this tree here frames the picture and makes it so that the viewer knows what to look at. So this tree and this tree right here, because the waterfall are placed within those two trees, it kind of frames the waterfalls themselves. The foreground over here doesn't add or distract too much. I don't think it's dead space, just because I think it allows the waterfall a little bit more room to breathe and show where it's flowing. These tree trunks also kind of connect to the waterfall itself, and so they're not just placed there for no reason. If there was more space over here, then I would say it's dead space, but because I'm still cut off by this tree and everything, and these tree trunks are on this side of the tree, they still look like it is a part of the waterfall. Another thing is these leaves still frame these tree trunks as well, so that makes it so that they are part of the kind of enclave where the waterfalls lie. In terms of color, I think the effect is pretty good. Usually sometimes you might see the paths be a little bit too brown, but I've brought down the temperature a little bit and made sure that the color of the waterfall is actually what the water should look like, rather than a very deep blue or dark blue or excessively blue color you can think of for a waterfall. So this image is actually one that I really liked at that time, but I really don't like it now. And the reason is that there's just so much dead space in this image. This part between the trunk and the rocks, boulders at the back, it's just dead space right here. There's nothing going on over here. In the sky as well, it's not too bad. Let's see what happens if I actually crop it down. Now it might look a little bit better, I think, just because that extra sky was, again, not adding too much. There was nothing to balance the sky with anything here, and there was nothing interesting about the sky. Maybe the color was interesting, but there was nothing that the sky was adding. This rock on the side, it's not too distracting because this kind of log forces you to kind of follow this into the center of the image, but it's not really placed well. So what I would like to have seen for myself at that time is going lower and looking through the log, so that when you look, you would have the arch above the image and below the image, and then the guide of the log would go to the back here. There's not a whole lot of interesting subject over here, but I think the rocks themselves with the shadow and the lighting actually work pretty well. It's just that it's not placed properly. The camera wasn't placed too high up. This golden ratio type of compositional tool that I've used here kind of just ends within the log itself. So yeah, a lot of mistakes were made with this photo. In terms of sharpness, the back is pretty sharp, front is pretty sharp. I think I focus stacked this image. I really love all the different details that you can see within the log, but again, not framed well, not composed well enough, and too much dead space right here. At that time, really proud of this photo. Now, I don't really like it. The colors, I like the color and the shadow because it was blue light hour. It has really nice tones, but they just don't work well with the composition. This is another photo in Colorado that I took, and I really liked taking this photo as well. The sun was setting and it cast this really nice glow on the mountain side, but because of another mountain blocking the view here, we see that this part is all kind of dark, but it has a nice contrast against this, and I really like the shadow kind of spikes that appear here from the trees. So it's a simple pathway that goes down, and I like the fact that there's a hill here that brings the viewer down as well as this kind of crevice that would again align the viewer to this kind of corner here, and right above this are these two mountains. So you can easily tell what the main subject of this photo is. It's these two mountains right here. There are plenty of leading lines going to that. So 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 4. And so I think it's pretty clear where the subject is. I think it's composed really well, except the mountains aren't big enough. The mountains are pretty small. I use a wide angle lens here to kind of enhance the curvature of the path. And I really like this grass along the way because I think the texture just works so well. But again, because I'm using wide angle lens, I can't use perspective compression to get the mountains in the back looking larger. And so that's one of the issues of this image is the wide angle part looks well, but because of that, the perspective compression isn't there for these mountains to look a lot bigger. I do have another picture with the mountains looking bigger, but then I wasn't able to get the same path curvature that I liked. Other than that, I think the photo is pretty sharp throughout. Yeah, I think particularly in the foreground, I wanted to capture these grass blades as sharp. If they were moving, it would appear a little bit blurry, which might or might not have affected it, but I think overall it does pretty well. I don't think it would benefit from a further crop, just because I like the positioning of the angle. So if I were to crop it further, let's say here, now it looks too tight. What we want is this line to start in the corners. Starting the lines in corner is something that I'm trying to do a lot more of, just because it adds a really nice natural location for things to merge to, things to come out of, etc. And so I think overall the lines look really well here. Here it doesn't really matter too much because it's not connected to the top corner. There, the top corner has this blanket sky over here. So we're good with that. Overall, I think a really great photo. The light on the sky is a little bit too dull. Maybe if this mountain had a little bit more shadow on it, it would have worked even better. And if the mountain was a little bit bigger, it would have been more obvious what it was. But I think use of the rule of thirds and leading lines pretty efficiently. This is a photo that I took actually at the same location as that one, and I really like the light falling on the house, but there are a couple of things that I think don't work well for this photo. So ideally, I wanted the path to lead into the house, and that house being the main subject of the photo. But there's this distracting neighborhood over here where your eye kind of gets drawn to as well because it's kind of busy, and so that becomes a little bit more distracting. And so I could crop it out. Let's say I crop it out like this. It works to an extent, but I think it becomes a little bit too tight. I don't get to see the nice backdrop, which added a lot more story to this kind of little hut to create this fairy tale feeling of a hut in the middle of the mountainous area. I think the positioning of the hut and the path works pretty well. The path starts on the right, the house ends up on the left. I think that still looks pretty good. Yeah, I think the lighting is pretty good. I think the shrubs balance each other out and aren't distracting and add to the overall scene. Even this over here, I don't think it takes away too much. Maybe I could have removed it. I think this bigger portion of the shrub is a little bit distracting because it cuts into the path itself, but overall, I think it doesn't make too big of a difference. I could say that that part of the photo, this neighborhood in the back and the mountains, are part of the story that I want to tell for this image, but I think because they're on the edge and because they are just too small, it just becomes not a big enough element for it to be a good story. Maybe if I had more space on the right side and I had made it so that the house and the neighborhood balance each other diagonally, and they had enough weight to both of them. Right now the house has more weight than the neighborhood. If they had equal amount of weight, then I could see myself saying that would be a good story. Actually, I should have done that. I don't know, I really wasn't thinking at that time. But yeah, I think that would make for a much better photo and where I could keep both in the neighborhood as well. So hopefully this video gave a good indication of how I critique my own photos. And if you saw throughout my critiquing process, I was thinking about what I would do differently in terms of composition when I would go back to that same location. Sure, the lighting might be different, the condition might be different, but I would still be able to control the composition a little bit better. So remember, the most important thing when critiquing your own photos is to approach it like you're solving a problem. So determine what it is about the photo that you want to say, what is the story, what is the subject, what is it that you want to talk about with the photo. Then take a look at the distracting elements, if there are any in the photo, that don't add to that subject, that don't add to that story. And then from there, you can think about other elements as well, such as lighting and conditions that don't really work well, that enhance that subject that you want to focus on. Sure, on top of that, you again have to focus on all the different technical parts of it. So is the subject in focus? Is it the correct level of sharpness? Are things blurry that need to be blurry? And are things sharp that need to be sharp? Things like that can be then used to feed back into your actual photography in the field. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please leave a thumbs up if you did. And remember to subscribe down below. Let me know in the comments what are your biggest things that you look for in your critique of your own photos, and whether or not you have other things you would focus on when critiquing your photos. But I'll see you next time.